When my son raised his glass that evening and smiled at the people seated around that long mahogany table, I thought maybe tonight would be different. Maybe he would say something kind. Instead, he laughed the easy laugh of a man trying to impress people he believed were better than his own family, and he pointed directly at me. "This is my dad," my son said. "He spent 30 years swinging a hammer. Retired now, mostly just putters around the house, fixes things that don't need fixing." A few polite chuckles drifted through the dining room. At the far end of the table, the man my son's girlfriend called father hadn't laughed. He sat perfectly still with his wine glass halfway to his lips, and he was staring at me the way a person stares at a word they recognize but can't quite place. His eyes moved slowly across my face. Then he set his glass down. "Excuse me," he said quietly. His voice cut through the laughter like a knife through still water. "Did you say your name was Calloway?" The table went silent. The Whitfield home sat at the end of a private road in Richmond, the kind of neighborhood where the gates open automatically because the people who live behind them expect the world to move out of their way. I had driven past the stone pillars twice before my son called me and told me to follow the GPS, not my instincts. His words, not mine. He had been anxious about this dinner for 3 weeks. I could hear it every time he called. That careful, measured tone he used when he was trying to manage something he believed was fragile. Claire's family was important, he kept saying. Her father had built half the commercial real estate corridor downtown. Her mother sat on 3 nonprofit boards. Her grandfather had a building named after him at the university. "Just be yourself, Dad," my son finally said the night before the dinner. Then he paused just long enough that I understood he didn't entirely mean it. I wore the gray slacks I kept for funerals and church, a white dress shirt, no tie. My hands were clean, but the knuckles were the knuckles of a man who had spent decades doing physical work, thick and scarred in small ways that don't go away no matter how many years you've been behind a desk instead of a tool belt. When I arrived, my son met me at the front door ahead of his girlfriend. He looked me over once, the way a man inspects something before presenting it to someone whose opinion matters. "You look fine," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a verdict. The Whitfield dining room was the kind of space designed to remind guests of the distance between their life and yours. A long table of dark wood, chairs with high upholstered backs, walls lined with framed architectural photographs of buildings I recognized immediately. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight and scattered it across the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, someone had put on classical music, low enough to feel expensive but high enough to fill every silence. My son's girlfriend met me in the hallway before we sat down. She was warm and sincere in the way young people sometimes are when they're trying hard to make a good impression on a parent. She shook my hand with both of hers. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "All good, I hope," I replied. She smiled. "Of course." Her parents entered together from a side door, the way people enter rooms they own. Her father was tall, silver-haired, with the deliberate posture of a man who had stopped needing to prove himself some time ago. Her mother wore a simple black dress and the particular kind of jewelry that doesn't announce itself. They introduced themselves as Richard and Eleanor. Richard Whitfield shook my hand firmly and looked at me with the practiced friendliness of a man who had shaken thousands of hands in rooms very much like this one. We sat. Soup arrived without anyone asking for it. The conversation began the way these conversations always do, with safe questions about travel, with comments about the weather, with small observations about the city that allowed everyone at the table to locate themselves in relation to one another. My son relaxed as the evening wore on. I watched him settle into his chair, accept a second pour of wine, begin to laugh more easily. He belonged here. Or at least he believed he did, and sometimes believing it is more than half the work. At some point, Eleanor asked how my son and I had spent time together growing up. "Honestly," my son said, swirling his wine, "Dad was always working. He was a contractor. Small company, mostly residential stuff." He smiled at me with the careful affection of a man drawing a fence around something. "He built decks, finished basements, kept the lights on." "That's honest work," Richard said. "Oh, absolutely," my son agreed quickly, the way people agree with something right before they minimize it. "He was good at it. Very good, actually. Just, not exactly the corporate world. He laughed. Claire laughed softly beside him. Eleanor smiled politely. I cut a piece of the salmon on my plate and said nothing. My son continued, warming to the subject the way people do when they've had 2 glasses of wine and an audience they want to impress. He used to show up to my school events with sawdust on his jacket. I used to be so embarrassed. He shook his head with a grin. Sorry, Dad. True story. It's fine, I said. He's being modest, my son added, glancing around the table. He worked hard, he really did. He was just very... He searched for the word manual. He was great with his hands. Not so much with spreadsheets. Another easy laugh. Richard Whitfield, who had been listening quietly for several minutes with that particular stillness that very experienced men sometimes use, turned to me then. What was the name of your company? He asked. Callaway Construction, I said. The table continued around us. My son said something to Claire about the salmon. Eleanor mentioned a trip to Portugal she and Richard were planning for the fall. But Richard had not moved. He was looking at me the way a man looks at something he is trying to measure. Callaway Construction, he repeated slowly. That's right. Out of Mill Haven, I set my fork down. Started there, yes. Something shifted behind Richard Whitfield's eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like the slow recognition of a picture coming into focus. Dinner continued. Plates were cleared and replaced with something elegant involving roasted vegetables and beef. The conversation moved on to real estate markets, to Claire and my son's plans for the future, to a renovation project Richard's company was completing near the waterfront. But Richard Whitfield did not move on. I noticed it in small ways. The way he would steer the conversation somewhere else, and then, a few minutes later, steer it back. The way his eyes returned to me between sentences addressed to other people. His wife noticed too. At one point, she placed her hand briefly on his arm, and he nodded slightly without looking at her. My son was deep in a conversation with Claire about an apartment they were considering in the new tower downtown. He was explaining the floor plan with the enthusiasm of a man who had found a future he could show other people. Dad, he said suddenly, turning to include me with the generous energy of someone who has forgotten to check in on a guest. You should see this place. It's the Meridian Tower, brand new. Beautiful views. I know the building, I said. Really? He was mildly surprised. How? I picked up my wine glass. I've been by it. He accepted this and returned to his conversation. Across the table, Richard Whitfield watched me for a long moment. Then he excused himself quietly and stepped away from the table. He returned 10 minutes later. He sat down, placed his napkin back in his lap with deliberate care, and said nothing for a moment. Eleanor looked at him. He gave her a small nod, the private language of 30 years of marriage. My son was still talking about the apartment. I'm sorry to interrupt, Richard said. His voice was measured, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. He was looking at me. I want to ask you something directly. The table quieted. Of course, I said. Callaway Construction merged with Hargrove Development in 2009, he said. And before the merger, it was responsible for the structural build of the Millhaven Medical Center, the Jefferson Avenue office complex, and the first phase of the Riverfront Commons project. My son had gone very still, Richard continued. The principal of Callaway Construction at the time of the merger was named Thomas Callaway. He paused. Am I talking to him? The room was completely silent. My son turned to look at me slowly, the way a man turns when he's beginning to understand that the floor beneath him is not quite what he assumed. Yes, I said. Richard Whitfield exhaled once through his nose. Then he looked at my son. Then back at me. Your son told me you build decks, he said. I did, I replied. That's how it started. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when everyone in it is recalibrating at the same time. It isn't empty, it is dense with the sound of people revising the story they had already decided was finished. My son was the first to speak. I don't understand, he said. He looked at me the way he used to look at things when he was a boy, and they didn't fit the shape he expected, a kind of confused blankness that was almost childlike in a man of 34. "What don't you understand?" I asked him. "The riverfront commons." He said it carefully, testing the weight of it. That's a significant project, Dad. That's a major development." "Yes, it is. You never told me that's what you were working on." I looked at him quietly. "You never asked." The honest truth of that sat between us without apology. Richard Whitfield cleared his throat gently. He was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a man who understood he was seeing something that belonged to the two of us and not to him, but who also recognized its significance. "I want to tell you something," Richard said, directing his words to my son, but keeping his gaze on me. "The Millhaven Medical Center is still considered one of the best executed mid-sized hospital builds in the region. The mechanical systems in that building were designed with a level of foresight that most contractors wouldn't have thought to apply to a project that size." He paused. "I know because we bid on the structural renovation of the East Wing 4 years ago, and the engineers who walked through it couldn't stop talking about how it had been originally built." My son stared at his father. I said nothing. Eleanor broke the silence. "You never told Claire's family what you actually built," she said to me. It was not an accusation. It was close to admiration. "It didn't come up," I said. She studied me for a moment. "No. I imagine it rarely does when other people are busy deciding for you." My son looked down at his plate, then he looked up again. The wine flush in his face had shifted into something else, something that didn't have a clean name. "Dad," he said. "It's all right," I said. "No, he stopped. He set down his fork and folded his hands on the table in front of him the way his mother used to do when she was preparing to say something that mattered. He had always done that unconsciously, inherited the gesture without knowing it. I had watched it emerge in him over the years and never mentioned it, the same way I had never mentioned 100 other things I quietly noticed. "I told them you built decks," he said. "You told them what you knew," I said. "That's not a crime." "I told them what I thought I knew." He exhaled slowly. "There's a difference." The candles on the table had burned lower without anyone noticing. Outside the tall windows at the far end of the room, the lights of the city were visible between the trees, a long row of towers against the dark sky. Richard Whitfield followed my gaze toward the window. "The Beridian Tower your son mentioned," he said quietly. "The mechanical infrastructure design. That was a Callaway spec, wasn't it? Even after the merger, they kept your original systems model." "They did," I said. He nodded slowly. "I thought so. We own 2 floors in that building." My son was very quiet. After dinner, Claire and her mother moved into the sitting room. My son walked out through the glass doors onto the terrace, and I followed him. The night air was cool. The Whitfield property extended into the darkness beyond the terrace, a long lawn edged with old trees. My son stood at the stone railing with his hands in his pockets, looking out at nothing in particular. I stood beside him. For a while, neither of us spoke. "You built the medical center," he finally said. Not a question. "Among other things." He was quiet again. "When I was in high school," he said slowly, "you were driving that old white truck, the one with the broken AC. I used to pretend I didn't see it in the school parking lot. I remembered the truck. I'd driven it for 11 years because it worked and because trucks do not impress clients the way buildings do. And I had always known which one mattered." "I remember," I said. "Why didn't you drive something better?" "Because I was building something that required most of what I had," I said. The truck was fine. He turned his head to look at me. "You could have told me." "I tried," I said. "When you were about 15, I sat down with you and explained what the company was becoming, what I was working toward." He frowned. "I don't remember that." "No," I said. You had a basketball game the next morning and you were only half listening. I said it without bitterness. You were 15. That was appropriate. He let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. And then later, he said, when I was older, you could have... You already had a picture of me, I said gently. The man with sawdust on his jacket. The man with the truck. You were proud of me for working hard, and that was enough. I didn't need to hand you a different version just so the story looked better at someone else's dinner table. He flinched slightly at that. Good. I did not say it to be cruel. I said it because it was the exact shape of the truth, and he needed to feel its edges. I embarrassed you in there, he said. You introduced me as what you believed I was, I said. That's not embarrassment. That's just information. I said you weren't in the corporate world. I know. I said you weren't good with spreadsheets. I am actually quite good with spreadsheets, I said, but I take your point. He almost smiled. Then it faded. I was showing off, he said. For them. I was trying to, position myself. Make sure they knew I was different from where I came from. I looked at him. He was my son completely, in the line of his jaw and the way he stood, in the habit he had of speaking the truth about himself eventually, if you gave him enough space and didn't push. His mother had been the same way. Where you came from is not a liability, I said. I know that. Do you? He didn't answer immediately. Below the terrace, a light wind moved through the trees and the branches made a slow, soft sound. She's going to think I'm an idiot, he said finally. Claire, she heard everything. Yes, I agreed, she did. She heard me call her own father's buildings out of reach of what our family could understand, he said. And the whole time her father was sitting there knowing exactly who you were. Or trying to remember, I said. He wasn't certain until partway through dinner. My son thought about this. Why didn't he say something sooner? Because he was watching, I said. Some people pay attention before they speak. It's a useful habit. He was quiet for a long time. The lights in the sitting room behind us glowed warmly through the glass. We could see Claire and her mother through the window, their heads close together in the way of two people who are talking seriously but are not upset. She's not angry, I told him. He followed my gaze. How do you know? Because her mother has her hand on her arm, I said. When women are angry, they turn toward each other. When they're just sorting through something, they sit like that. He looked at me. How do you know things like that? I've been watching people for 63 years, I said. It adds up. He almost smiled again. This time it held. We went back inside when the night air had done what night air does, cleared enough of the weight that it was possible to breathe normally again. The sitting room was warm and the lamps threw comfortable circles of light across the furniture and the bookshelves. Richard Whitfield was standing by the fireplace with a glass of bourbon. He looked up when we came in, and something in his face was easy now, open in a way it hadn't been during dinner. I owe you an apology, my son said to him. Richard shook his head slightly. You owe me nothing. You didn't know. I should have. Perhaps, Richard said. But the truth is, your father is not the kind of man who hands out his resume at family dinners. I've met a few men like that in my career. He looked at me. They're rarer than they should be. Claire crossed the room and sat down beside my son on the small sofa near the window. She didn't say anything to him immediately. She took his hand and held it. He looked at her and she looked back, and some conversation occurred between them that required no words at all. The beginning of the kind of fluency that long relationships are built on. I sat down in the chair nearest the fireplace. Eleanor handed me a cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one. It was exactly right, strong enough to mean something, with 1 spoon of sugar. How did you know? I asked her. She tilted her head. About the sugar, I said. She tilted her head. About the sugar, I said. She smiled. Lucky guess. Then actually, Richard takes his the same way. 31 years. Some things transfer. Richard settled into the chair across from me. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at me with the straightforward attention of a man who did not regard directness as aggression. Can I ask you something? He said. Go ahead. After the merger, when you stepped back from the company, he paused. Why all the way back? It was a fair question. After the Hargrove merger, most people in my position would have taken a board seat, maintained visibility, leveraged the brand. Instead, I had moved to a smaller house in a quieter neighborhood and spent the first year doing exactly what my son had described, fixing things around the house that didn't strictly need fixing. My wife passed away the same year the merger closed, I said. The room was quiet. She never cared about the company the way some spouses do, I said. She cared about the same things at the end that she'd cared about at the beginning. Good coffee, walks in the evening, knowing the people she loved were near. I paused. After she was gone, I realized I had spent a considerable amount of time building things in the world and not enough time building things inside my own house. Eleanor had gone very still. So I stepped back, I said. I still consult, I still have the work, but I stopped needing people to know about it. Richard Whitfield looked at me for a long moment. Your son didn't know about any of this either, he said. It was not a question. He knew his mother was ill, I said. He was here for all of that. I considered the words. He saw the version of me that was present during the hardest years. Quieter, less. And that version became the version he carried. Across the room, my son was listening. He had let go of Claire's hand and was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in exactly the posture I had sat in 10,000 times at kitchen tables and job sites, and I recognized myself in him so completely that for a moment I couldn't speak. Dad, he said. I looked at him. I didn't know it was that year, he said. I didn't know the merger and Mom were. He stopped. I knew she was sick. I was there, but I didn't put those together. You weren't supposed to, I said. That wasn't your weight to carry, but it was yours. Yes, I said. It was mine. That's how it works. He nodded slowly. His eyes were bright in the way that a man's eyes get when he is holding something in that wants to come out, and he has not yet decided whether this is the room for it. I'm sorry, he said. For tonight. For the things I said. For tonight. For the things I said. For not, he exhaled, for not asking better questions. I should have been easier to ask, I said. He shook his head. That's not on you. We looked at each other across the room in the way fathers and sons sometimes look at each other when they have finally stopped performing for everyone else, and are just two people sitting with the complicated truth of having been each other's family through years that didn't ask permission before arriving. You built the medical center, he said again. Quietly this time, differently. I built it, I said. I was born there, he said. I smiled. I know. The evening wound down the way evenings do when the difficult thing has been said and the room can breathe again. Richard and I talked for another hour about construction, about the ways the industry had changed, about a project his company was considering near the old rail yards on the south side of the city. He asked careful, informed questions and listened to the answers completely, which is the mark of a man who has been genuinely successful, rather than merely rich. Before we left, he shook my hand at the door and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake requires. I'd like to call you, he said. Not about business, just. He glanced at our children across the foyer, my son holding Claire's coat, the two of them talking quietly. I think we're going to be seeing quite a lot of each other. I imagine so, I said. Eleanor kissed me on the cheek, which surprised me enough that I didn't have a response ready, and she seemed to find that satisfying. My son walked me to my car in the dark of the driveway. The gravel made a soft sound underfoot. Above us, the sky was very clear. At the car door, he stopped me. Can I come over this weekend? He asked. Of course, I said. I want to hear it, he said. All of it. How it started. How you built it. I want to. He searched for the word and didn't find a small one, so he used the true one. I want to know you, the whole version. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 34 years old, and he had his mother's eyes and my hands and a whole life ahead of him that would teach him things I couldn't teach him. And standing there in the dark outside that house with the lights of the city glowing against the low clouds in the distance, I felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something that will last longer than he will. Not the buildings. "Come Sunday," I said, "I'll make breakfast." He nodded. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He hugged me, not the careful, brief hug of a grown son performing affection for an audience, but the kind of hug that means something. I held on to it. I drove home through the quiet streets of Ridgemont and then through the neighborhoods that connected that world to mine, past the hardware stores and the diners and the small yards with their ordinary trees, past the parts of the city that built the parts of the city that other people got to enjoy. My office light was still on when I got home, the desk lamp I always forgot to turn off. I went in and sat down and looked at the framed photograph on the wall above the desk, the one taken the morning we broke ground on the medical center 31 years ago. A young man in a hard hat standing in a muddy field with a shovel, squinting into the sun. I had kept it all these years not because it reminded me of the beginning of something great, but because it reminded me of the day I understood what I was doing with my life. I was fixing things, making things that were broken into things that worked, making things that didn't exist into things that would stand long after I was gone, things where people would be born and healed and treated with dignity, things where other people would spend their working lives and build their own futures. That was the whole story. Not the merger, not the portfolio, not the name on the contracts, the work, the 32 years of showing up and understanding what needed to be done and doing it without needing anyone to watch. I turned off the desk lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without any sense that the day had left anything important unfinished. If you've ever been the person in the room that no one thought to ask about, if someone has ever introduced you by the smallest version of what you are, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your story belongs in a room too. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe. We have more of them. Every one of them is true in the way that matters.